Hello everyone and welcome back to another Hearts of Iron 4 dev diary, as we now have a release date for Hearts of Iron 4 Arms Against Tyranny, which means we have a flux of content to get through before the actual release date arrives. Today is going to be kicking us off with a Norway alt history focus tree, so without further ado, let's take a look. So our dev diary begins being led by Carlo, or Chak I guess, depending on which username you want to go through. And we're just going to be looking at the communist, the alternative democratic, the Fascist and the monarchist path for Norway, because of course, monarchism will always be the fans' favourites. But we are not starting with monarchism here, we are instead starting with communism, talking about the one and only Leon Trotsky, or Lev Trotsky as he's called here. In Hearts of Iron 4 currently, he kind of persists in two locations, which is either the Soviet Union or Mexico, depending on which of the two focus trees you choose to use him with. But historically, he wasn't actually in either, especially at the beginning of the game's start. He was in Norway, so it only made sense for him to make an appearance in the communist focus tree for Norway. Should you follow on the path of trying to become a communist nation, we can see him here as an advisor for your government, giving you non-core manpower and minus 20% justify war goal time. That is a significant boost to justify war goal time. You can really cut down on some very quick wars. Ironically though, it's the Fascist party of Norway, led by Quisling, who aren't a fan of Mr. Shortened Justify War Goal Times, and as such they're trying to get rid of him, probably because he's a communist. As such, we have this event called the Fascist Harass Lev Trotsky, which is going to be available to you regardless of which political branch you go down, so I assume that even includes historical, meaning how you deal with Trotsky is going to impact your game. How you choose to deal with him is up to you. So historically, he was kept under house arrest for quite a while, which was to his degree somewhat torturous, before he was eventually sent out to Mexico. But you can choose to send him to Mexico straight away, or you could send him to Stalin to meet a probably somewhat unfortunate end in a kind of purge, or you can stick him in your government. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say if you're planning to join the Comintern, you might not want to have Trotsky in your government. You might want to send him to Stalin. With that, we get to take a look at the communist focus tree, which is divided up into two sections, compromising with the NKP and prosecuting the NKP. To simplify this choice down to a somewhat familiar choice for many people, compromising with the NKP, or the Communist Party of Norway, is going to involve basically going the path of the Stalinist. We can see here that there is a nice join the Comintern focus, inviting Soviet designers. So yeah, this is basically going to be your joining Stalin path, with a nice war against Finland if you so choose to do so. On the flip side, we have prosecuting the NKP, so not going with the Communist Party of Norway, and instead probably taking the position of Trotsky, because here we see the permanentist revolution. Okay, sure. We'll get into what the focuses are later, as well as sharing a branch with an alternative democratic tree. It's worth noting that on the Stalinist side, you only have one war against Finland noted here. On this side, you do have defending Finland, one presumes against Stalin, but you also have the proactive defense focuses. So perhaps there's a little bit more interest you can get out of the Stalinist, non-Stalinist path, the Trotsky path, but who's to say? Regardless, both branches share a central path with the seeds of the revolution, working your way down to kicking out the king and creating a new Norway. Side note, I have noticed that some of the focuses don't actually have capital letters on certain words, and sometimes, oh my goodness, I just struggle with it. As we quickly descend to see what all of the communist focuses do, we can start with compromise with the NKB, which as we can see here is a nice boost in communist popularity, some political power and a boost of opinion with the Soviet Union, which is to be expected if you're joining up with the Stalinists. But on the flip side, if you choose to prosecute the NKB, you'll get less communism but more political power, I guess because it's more independent, as well as a political advisor, Jeanette Olsen, who gives you some really good construction speed. Of course, the Soviet Union is probably not going to like you going against them. Regardless of whether you're picking the Stalinist or the Trotskyist path though, the actual process of converting Norway into becoming a communist country seems like it's going to be rooted in a civil war, and it's going to be using the old mechanic which we've seen with the Spanish Civil War and the Soviet Union, with the free state decision ticks. So we'll have a close look as we zoom in. So on the left we have rousing the proletariat, where we have to rouse in each of the individual states popularity for the civil war, and assuming that you've got 1, 2 or 3, you'll have a varying chance of that state flipping with a certain amount of units or not, which will help you in the civil war. Bear in mind that it does say here total support for our revolution 1 out of 20. So if I'm going to take a guess on that, that means that you can only choose to flip or click these buttons, let's say, 20 times. And there is more than 20 buttons here. With 10 states listed there, with 3 ticks available, that's 30 to 20, that means 10 ticks you're not actually going to be able to use. But considering in total to get there, it's probably going to cost you 1,000 political power, I'm not going to worry too much about the inability to click this button so much. To see what those decisions actually do when you click them, here we see rousing the proletariat in Telemark, where if you select it, the support will go up by 1, as we saw with that 1 out of 20, and when this civil war begins, this state will join the communist side, but heavy damage will happen to the factories and infrastructure within it. At level 2, the damage that you do to the factories and infrastructure will be moderate as opposed to devastating, and you get 2 friendly units on your side when the war begins. And then for the Giga tryhards, if you choose to go all the way to a level 3 in a state, you get the communist side joining, 2 militia divisions, and very light damage on the factories. So probably not as important to get to level 3, but getting to level 2 in as many states as possible, just for the sheer numbers, is going to be pretty good. The dev diary does take the time to clarify that if you do just go for level 2, then in theory there are 10 states, level 2, 20 points, you could get level 2 in every state. Well, they say that no matter what, the civil war is going to happen, and the other side will have Oslo. So you will have to capture Oslo. This is a non-negotiable. The civil war cannot be avoided. In my personal opinion, I feel like if you're going to sit there and spend, 1,000 political power or whatever, 500 at the minimum, to avoid a civil war, and if it takes as long as it does, I think there's an argument to be made that there should be an option to allow you to skip the civil war by just waiting it out, because you're effectively just wasting your time and political power to just avoid the war. So I feel like that kind of player choice trade-off is okay, but in this instance they've chosen not to go with it, and you will just have to fight the civil war. Taking a look at some of the focuses you have access to, assuming you've won that civil war, here's that war in Finland focus I was talking about earlier. So, assuming that the Soviet Union is at war with Finland, or at least has a war goal against Finland, then you have the option to join in, gaining the Liberate Finland spirit. All in all, it's a pretty good spirit, giving you some weekly manpower, some stability modifiers to try and keep you going, but specifically it's really about the attack and breakthrough bonus against Finland, so they're going to struggle defending against you. There isn't too much of a land border between Norway and Finland, and what little land border there is, it's just awful to fight through. Also take note that it says at the bottom, unlocks the shared focus reaching out to our neighbours and the Nordic March. So that's to do with the joint focus tree, and I'm wondering to what extent is this to do with you annexing a part of Finland or just locking you out? I'm not quite sure how that interaction works exactly. On the far more chaotic side, we have the Permanentist revolution following on with Trotsky, in which you can create possibly up there with the most strange factions in the game, the Norintern. The Norintern. It's like the Comintern, but it's the Norintern. Ignoring that though, we gain a national spirit, the permanent revolution, and this is nothing to be scoffed at. This spirit looks ridiculous. So you gain 0.5 daily political power gain. So that's 50% of a Hitler, okay? Before you even begun. 50%. So that's already ridiculous. This division recovery rate plus 20%. Usually we're looking at 5s and 10s. For some reason it's 20. Really good. Plus 10 war support, nothing to be scoffed at. And just add this one on for good measure. Justify war goal time, minus 40%. Bear in mind that earlier we saw Trotsky as a political visor at minus 20. If these two are compatible with one another, that's minus 60. But even if it isn't, minus 40% reduction in war goal time is really, really good. And of course, in case any of that wasn't fun enough for you, you also gain war goals against Sweden, Finland, Denmark and Iceland to try and unify the entire Nordic region. I just wonder if there is the formable nation to unite the Nordics is available to you even post DLC, because sometimes when they do a DLC for a region, the previous formable nation gets kind of invalidated and locked behind focuses. So I do wonder if you'll be able to unite all that land with this focus. TLDR, it looks pretty strong. So, with the communist side of things done, let's move over to the Allied Democratic branch, because as we saw in the historical branch, it was kind of just fixing up Norway, not really getting too involved until eventually you found Mr. Badman, Mr. Bad Mustache Man on your doorstep. In this version of events, you're going to be a little bit more proactive and a little bit more unified in your outgoing approach. Taking a look at the focus tree as it is here, the vote of no confidence, which has no focus R, and the N isn't capitalized, nor is the C, just small things. We'll see that it's got a shared section with the Trotsky communist branch, and it has a shared section with the historical democratic branch. So this is kind of the mixing two worlds together focus tree branch, which I always really like in focuses. It's one of the reasons I like Mexico so much, is because it's a real mix and match focus tree, and I think this does well. Take note that it has things where you join the allies and then create a proactive defense against Sweden and Denmark. I wonder if these proactive defense focuses involve just getting a war goal with no context, or if you specifically need like Sweden to have 10% communism and then you're allowed to go in. Those are the kind of things I'm wondering, because if not, you could create like a democratic Scandinavia, you know, pretty early on, assuming you can just zoom down these focuses with the backing of the allies. It seems that the core gameplay, especially at the start for Norway, is going to be preparing for the preparing for the war against Germany, which was true when we saw it previously in the historical Norway branch. So a little bit of a flash to the past. Here we see the historical Norway dev diary as it was released to us, goodness, a month or two ago, I think. And in it, we can also see that the decisions to brace for the storm are here, which are very similar to the alt history. So the two branches, both sides of the democratic, are not too dissimilar to each other, except in this version you're specifically trying to develop up the states, while in the alt history path, you're trying to prepare for a war. Taking a look at the decisions section in its totality, we can see the developed decisions have become prepared decisions, and each time you take them, you gain a national preparedness up to a cap of 30, and it seems that you can spend your preparedness on these decisions, so economic relief measures, expanding the military industry, naval expansion, which I assume is like dockyards, military factories, and maybe a consumer goods reduction. Note that you will be spending convoys on these, so those naval expansions are nothing to be laughed at, because building convoys is directly related to building up your industry. Moving swiftly through here, we see that you can prepare for war, which was a similar decision to what we saw with the historical branch, giving you 1 civ and 1 preparedness for you to spend, but keep an eye on that weekly stability drop. That is no fun, especially if it starts stacking up. And as you progress and keep taking the decisions, you'll eventually start preparing ADGA for war, in this particular example, where you'll get some local population, 5 aluminium, so maybe building up some air force is possible, with that preparedness on top. The dev diary briefly talks about how some focuses share a path with the Trotskyist path, which I did mention specifically in relation to warring Sweden and Denmark, but we don't actually get to find out what that implies. So I don't really know what the conditions are for you to be able to unite Scandinavia, either as a communist or as a alternative democratic, but you do have the prepare for war focus, which gives you some mills, dockyards, air bases, 10,000 men, which is a pretty strong unit, and some really good building up some mill factories. I guess you are preparing for war after all. Okay, we're over halfway through, so I hope you're all still with us. It's time to take a look at the Fash path, which is, I wonder to what extent it's going to involve siding with Mr. Mustache. Taking an introductory look just to see what it looks like, we can see the split off from the historical path, so the Fash invasion of Norway, which means that should Norway get invaded by Germany, as happened historically, you have the option to take over as a Quisling and start playing the Quisling's coup. So this kind of, you can either start this at the very beginning in 1936, or you can switch over from a historical game to start playing Quisling's coup. It's never too late to take up this path. Again, a lot of this was actually discussed to some degree in the historical dev diary as to you can either go with Quisling or get rid of him, so there's not too much to cover here, but we will be able to take a look at some of these more interesting focuses in addition. This focus tree path begins with absolute chaos in the Norwegian parliament, with people becoming ever concerned about the state of Europe and that Norway is not going to bring in an era of stability. Things are not looking good. As such, similar to what we saw with the communist mechanic, the Fascist mechanic is going to involve the decisions where you have to get to tier 3, eventually building up for a old familiar civil war. I won't go into it too deeply, but I'm sure you understand the mechanic by now, as I've already discussed it. Unlike in other civil wars that we've seen in the game, this one comes with a unique decision to invite the German Reich to help you invade Norway. That means perhaps if your civil war isn't quite going the way you had hoped it to, you can actually call in friends to come help you. Skipping past the more historical Quisling focuses, we arrive at some far more alt-historical looking focuses, such as Old of Vinland, in which you try to reclaim an outlandish Viking-themed empire, so demanding the United Kingdom give you Newfoundland and Labrador for a new land in the Americas. I think of all of the focuses listed down here, the ones that interest me the most I think are claims on Ireland, because with Ireland you have like an actual decent line to go up against Britain. It shouldn't be as difficult, especially if you haven't caused too much world tension early on, which means that down here you can actually get Ireland without any interjection. Eventually you've got your Denmark and Sweden claims to hopefully create like a Scandinavia and eventual Nordic Union. And finally, we arrive at the cream of the crop, everybody's personal favourite, the monarchist focus tree path. So of course this is where everybody goes into their Poland mind and compares it to the gargantuan Polish monarchist tree that we saw. So starting with the failures of the Norwegian government, we move down to try and put King Haakon in power, his rise to power, until eventually a regent takes over. You get your Kingdom of Norway. Oh no, the K is not capitalised. That's not going to bother me too much, I hope. And eventually you get some shared focuses at the end, so here's the Denmark and Sweden claims, leading to a consolidation of the kingdom, as well as some claims on the Faroe Islands, so you might have some issues there, some conflict there, getting Iceland, and Erik Raudsland. I'm sure we'll have to cover that when we come to it. So the dev diary begins by explaining how the king in question, King Haakon, wasn't really too enthusiastic about becoming a king, and certainly not enthusiastic at all about having any ruling power, and as such the focus tries to emulate that by having a regent stand in his stead. He does help for stability, but he might cost you a little bit, just something you might want to consider. It would seem that every single focus tree path for Norway basically takes advantage of the ticking decision state-based power thing, and we see it here with monarchist demonstrations. It says that by taking these focuses, while your actual ability to build anything in these states is effectively gone down for a year, you will have a better ability to build land forts and coastal forts here. The dev diary also says that it gives you building slots, but I don't actually see building slots listed in the decision text, so I'm not sure if that's a bug or an oversight or something else. Similarly, moving up, we see that if you continue to build support, you'll start getting very loyal supporters joining your military, creating some divisions, and with the support for the monarchy ticking up, one can only assume that eventually you can spend your support for the monarchy on things like propping up the economy, make assurances to the people of Norway, which I guess is stability boosting, and promote the armed defence of Norway, which I would assume is war support. As every CK3 player will tell you, the succession can be one of, if not the most, crucial mechanics to any monarchy. Goodness knows it can rip your entire kingdom apart if you don't play things well. So as such, the focus tree has a section dedicated to Prince Olav, heir to the throne of Norway. I actually quite like what they've done with the focus tree here, in which you get to decide whether you think Prince Olav shall become an army general or a admiral. It's actually one of those really good roleplay things where it feels like there's a butterfly effect in history where you can just slightly change a very minor thing and it could have very rapid consequences for the state of the country. So if Olav chooses to go with the army staff, you gain some army experience, command power, and him as a general. Or on the flip side, if you chose to send him to the navy staff, you can have some 50 navy XP, 20 command power, and have him as a naval commander. It is also worth noting that the focuses you get following on from that will be dependent on if he is in the army or the navy. So it seems here that stuff to do with building forts and maybe getting people to have more recruitable population is involved with the army, so this is quite important. But on the flip side, if you choose to go with the navy branch, you get coastal forts and probably stuff to do with building more and more ships. So recruitable population or building a giant navy. I guess you decide on what gameplay you want to go with. And the final thing we get to see in this dev diary is some of the later game options that a monarchist Norway has to do, including claims on the Faroe Islands, where Norway gets to ask Denmark if they can just casually have the Faroe Islands or risk a possibly deadly little war. The dev diary ends it by saying that there are actually many more things they could have talked about in this dev diary, but chose to keep as a secret for release, or haven't been implemented yet, or there is redacted of redacted, whatever that means. They finish up by saying stay tuned for the Sweden Alt History dev diary, so one can only assume that Sweden is probably coming next week. Of course, this doesn't answer the question of what is Erik Raud's lands, so we should probably go take a look. It seems to be that Erik Raud is Eric the Red, and that would be his land in Greenland. So effectively this is just another demanding territory from Denmark focus. I do wonder why the two couldn't even be combined at that point, and maybe that spot could be used for demanding land from somebody else? Or better yet, there could have been an opportunity here to have a focus which was like Norway wants some degree of colonial empire and they have to ask Britain for one of their overseas territories. I think it could have been interesting to see Norway have like the Falkland Islands or something, or La Malvinas, I guess, as you would say in Spanish Argentinian. So, to wrap up this dev diary, my thoughts are currently that the communist tree is, as is expected, the traditional choosing to go with Stalin or not go with Stalin. However, some of the things you can do with it look pretty powerful, so maybe Communist Norway could be one of the most fun paths. The Old History branch basically looks like the historical branch, but with a lot of question marks over what you can do to form Scandinavia, if that's even possible. The Fascist path we of course already saw, which is basically just go to war with Britain to the best of your ability, so good luck with that. And finally the monarchist path, which I guess is traded to the fact that the monarchist branch of Norway historically was pretty passive, but I feel like there was opportunity to do perhaps a little more with colonies. I am reminded of how, is it not Norway that owns like a good chunk of Antarctica due to like one of the treaties? So I feel like, Norway does have some global presence, especially in the southern hemisphere, that I feel like could have been taken advantage of with a little colonist focus. Bear in mind, of course, that all of these focuses are built on top of the other focuses to do with industry and the army, as well as the joint focus tree path. So alt democratic and monarchist, they do have like the monarchist joint focus tree branch. So there is those focuses to take as well. With that being said, I'll say thank you very much for watching. I hope this was informative. I hope you enjoyed. I hope maybe you discovered something. If you like this video, feel free to like, feel free to subscribe, and I guess I'll see you next week for Sweden. What should not be Sweden next week? What should be like Denmark? Bye.